Welcome, everybody, from the Davis Center at Harvard. My name is Stephen Jones. I am the director of the program in Georgian Studies at the Davis Center, which began its existence in January of this year. This is the third panel that we are presenting this semester. The first panel we had on March the 10th that looked at questions of state-church relations in Georgia. We had another panel on the 23rd that looked at small states in the international order, and we looked at the impact, in particular, of Ukrainian events on Georgia. This is our capstone. It's going to be a discussion about the state of democracy in Georgia and Armenia, and we're very, very lucky to have such three tremendous scholars who are going to talk about this. We're going to start off with Hélène Landemore, who, and I will introduce them to you in a minute, and Georgi Derlugyan and Giga Zedania. Georgi is going to talk about primarily, I'm guessing, the situation in Armenia, but we'll be addressing the ideas and concepts of Helena and her book, Open Democracy. And Giga will talk primarily about the situation in Georgia. So let me introduce to you our speakers. We're going to start off with Hélène, who is going to talk some about her book, Open Democracy, which was published in 2020. It made a big impact. It's a really very elegant book that probes questions of democratic theory and looks in particular at the failings of representative democracy. When I read the book, I was thinking very seriously about how this might, how Helene's theories might apply to the situation in Georgia and in Armenia. We'll see what Georgi and Giga think of that. But let me just tell you a little bit about Hélène. She started her academic career at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and she got her PhD in political science at Harvard University in 2008. Her research and teaching interests include democratic theory, political epistemology, and theories of justice. We've brought her here to talk primarily about her work on democratic theory. She wrote a wonderful book called Democratic Reason in 2013, which won the Spitz Prize, which is an epistemic defense of democracy. Her latest book, as I mentioned, is Open Democracy, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, which proposes a vision of a new kind, a more open form of democracy based on non-electoral forms of representation. And we're looking very much forward very much to what Hélène has to say. So I'm going to give Hélène about 20 minutes or so to start us off, and then I will hand it over to Georgi, who will come next, and then Giga, who will wrap up. Let me tell you a little bit about our other two speakers, Georgi Derlugyan. He started off studying African history at the Institute of Afro-Asian Studies at Moscow State University, and he finished his PhD in 1995 at the Department of Sociology and the Fernand Braudel Center for the Study of Economies, Historical Systems, and Civilizations at New York University in Binghamton. Georgi is very well known in the field. He's, looking at his CV, I can't list any, his articles and books, which are really quite prolific. I would like to mention that currently he is professor of social research and public policy at New York University at the campus in Abu Dhabi. I would like to mention two of Georgi's works that I've read and made an impact on me and on the field. Of course, the first one, which most of us know very well, is Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus, a world systems biography, which was published way back in 2005, which is a fascinating study of the decline of the Soviet Union and the sources of ethnic violence in the Caucasus. And another book, Does Capitalism Have a Future?, which he wrote with Emmanuel Wallerstein, Randall Collins, and Michael Mann, and others. translated into 16 different languages. So again, a very important book and well read. Thank you, Georgi. And our third speaker is Giga Zedania, who is the rector of Ilia State University, former rector, I should say. He resigned after 8 years, I believe, Giga, in 2021, sorry. He studied philosophy, sociology, and cultural studies in Georgia and in the United States at Bard and at the CEU, the Central European University, and in Hungary, and obtained his PhD in Germany from the Ruhr University, Bochum. His publications range from European intellectual history to the socio-political transformation of the South Caucasus. And he has shown in academia and in his organizational work a passionate commitment to furthering the cause of open society in his native Georgia. Giga's been deeply involved with fashioning Ilia State University, which is one of the primary universities in Georgia, where I also happen to teach. And it's one of the youngest, largest, and most dynamic in the region. So we welcome Giga and we support his work as an educator and administrator. He's done a really important work there. His latest publication is called Modernization in Georgia, Theories, Discourses, and Realities, which was published by Verlag Press in 2018. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for your time. And I'm going to turn it over to Hélène, who is going to start off the conversation. And that's what I would like it to be, a conversation. If you have any questions, please put them in Q&A, not in the chat box, but in Q&A, and I will pass them on to the speakers. So Hélène, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Jones. Thank you to my fellow panelists for their contribution in advance. I really look forward to learning more about Georgia and Armenia, about which I know virtually nothing. But I do have a few things to say about elections and why, in my view, they are indeed not enough. So the question is, are elections enough? And as a political theorist, I'm filling in the blank here. Are they enough for what? And of course, I'm going to answer, are they enough for democracy, right? So elections, one can define as a formal and organized choice by vote of a person for a political office or other position. So note, first of all, that in the traditional definitions, it's a choice of outcome. It's not a choice of outcome precisely, it's a choice of person. So sometimes we do call referenda elections, but I think it's important to maintain the distinction and that we reserve the term elections to a choice of persons. So we could say, we could ask the questions more broadly, are elections enough for, say, the rule of law, liberalism, perhaps good political performance that we could measure by a certain outcome like economic growth or protection of human rights or education of the population or any such outcomes. But again, I will assume that the question is really about democracy. Are elections enough to basically guarantee that the regime is close enough to the ideal of a democracy? It's indeed generally how we tend to think of it. When we think of elections, when we think of democracy, the first thing that comes to mind are our elections. We think of the inked finger of Afghan women. We think of political campaigns and parties fighting it out for popular votes. And so the question, in fact, presupposes already that elections place us on a democratic continuum, right? That we're already somewhat on track, that elections move us in the right direction, though perhaps other things need to be added to guarantee a sort of democratic setup, regime, environment, society. So the question, I think, assumes that elections are perhaps not enough, but they're at least something, right? A necessary component, if not a sufficient one, perhaps not a sufficient one to place us above the necessary threshold. So there's a lot of assumptions built in the question already. And I think as a provocation, I'd like to basically argue that there's a more pessimistic answer, which refuses the premise of the question, right? Elections not only are not enough, right? They might even put us on the wrong track to begin with, but we're not on a continuum towards democracy if we add a few other things. We're actually on a different continuum that when things go wrong, actually can take us straight towards things like plutocracy or kleptocracy, meaning ruled by economic elites who manage to buy access to power, by elections, by parties, by the media, by all the things that maintain an illusion of democracy, but really are just instrumentalized. And kleptocracy in the case where it's a rotation of people who go into power just for the sake of themselves and their minions or just their own self-interest. So that would be the more pessimistic take. I have to admit that I'm not that pessimistic. I think that elections are perhaps to a degree compatible with democracy, but I think that if you look at the history of electoral government, electoral so-called democracies, and if you look at there's the formal properties of elections, in fact, it's not that obvious that they are democratic if we take democracy as a radical idea of equal distribution of power, right? So again, it's important to define terms, because if by democracy we mean something very minimal, which is a Schumpeterian notion of alternance in power of parties or competition of elites or something like that, then sure, then maybe elections are enough for democracy. But I think that we ought to have a more demanding notion of democracy that is closer to the etymology, right, which is people's power. And to me, the history of the last 200 years has been somewhat a process of cheapening of the word democracy, where it's been transformed from a radical ideal of people's power to the much more attainable, perhaps, but less exalting ideal of consent to power, right? So it's not exercise of power by the people, but just consent to power exercised by others. So now I would like to argue that, give a bit more flesh to the argument. I argue that elections are problematic from a democratic point of view for intrinsic and not just for contingent and empirical reasons. Because oftentimes people will say, well, yes, it's true that in some countries, there's too much corruption and it's not that democratic and elections are not free and fair, et cetera, but surely there's an ideal world where we could fix those things. And if only we could take money out of politics, if only we could educate people so they can have the competence to run for election and then represent the working class, or represent women, or represent minorities, or represent the downtrodden, etc., then sure enough, that would be true democracy. And I want to say something more. I mean, what I try to say in the book is something more radical, which is that even under the best circumstances, take, I don't know, Denmark, Norway, where you have, limited amount of social and economic inequality, at least in terms of income, because it's not so true of wealth anymore, where you have a vastly educated population, where you have all kinds of measures of trust that indicate, that this is as close to the ideal as you can get. Even there, the problem with elections is that they express a principle of distinction, as Bernard Mann famously sort of put it first. He's a political theorist and scientist from France who wrote a book called The Principles of Representative Government a few years back in the 1990s. And he really showed how quintessentially elections, and it's in the word itself, mean that we're going to select people based on how much they stand out from the rest of us, right? And typically they stand out because of their economic status, because of their charisma, because of their social position in the group, or for any other kind of reason, actually. Empirically, it will track those kind of criteria, but it could be something else. So, and if you select people on the basis of traits that are unique or distinctive or make them distinguished and separate, then it means that you're not going to distribute power equally. And that's problematic from a democratic point of view. So, and here I'd like to take a step back and look at the history of electoral democracies. And again, why it's not that democratic to begin with, even though sometimes in the 19th century, we decided that we were to relabel those regimes democracies. So our representative so-called democracies originate in what historians call representative governments. So they were never called democracies to begin with. So representative governments were governments where the law was made by periodically elected legislatures. And we only started to call these governments democracies circa 1830 in the US and France, roughly around the time that Tocqueville published his famous books on democracy in America, but what he had in mind was a society, actually, perhaps not so much the regime, because it was characterized by an equality of condition. And in Great Britain, the semantic move took place later, even around 1870. And what's ironic in a way is that we started to call democracies regimes that were designed actually as alternatives to democracies. They were designed as alternatives to monarchies and ancien regime types of governments, but they were also designed as alternatives to democracy as people's power. Why? Because the founders in the US and other countries imagined or thought that basically democracy meant mob rule. They were very much afraid of the physical presence of the people in the open meeting that they associated with ancient Greece. They were afraid of tyranny of the majority. They were afraid of the masses of poor people who might want to take away their property rights. So they basically designed a liberal Republican regime, that's what I prefer to call it, that was not a democracy. And certainly this was a huge improvement on what came before, right? There were an expansion of rights. There were, this idea of consent of the governed that was completely central to that construct, but it was not people's power. In fact, Madison famously wrote that the American Republic should be characterized by the total exclusion of the people in its collective capacity from any share in government. And that's why to this day, you don't have the possibility of a referendum, for example, at the federal level. It was unthinkable to give people the possibility to choose for themselves on any decision, on any choice directly. So this American regime, for example, was built after Republican principles of popular sovereignty and popular consent. But ultimately, it meant to empower elected or aristocracies of sorts with the best and most virtuous at the helm, and that overlapped with the richest and most educated. And those people were meant to refine and enlarge the popular judgment, which was meant to exercise itself only on the choice of leaders. So the liberal aspect comes from the emphasis on individual rights as Trump's. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Yeah, there's a spider in the room. I don't know what to say. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, we'll wait. We'll wait.
You know what to say? We can say that we envy. It looks like a beautiful picture.
I feel sorry for the spider. I don't know what's going to happen to it. There we are.
I am so sorry. I had to kill a spider, but now it's dead, and then I can proceed. Apologies to everyone. So the fact is that we did expand the franchise in the 19th century to non-propertied adult males and later blacks and women. So it became somewhat easy to convince ourselves that we had achieved the ideal of a democracy. After all, it's a huge improvement to be able to consent to the choice of our rulers and even to remove them when necessary. But as it turns out, and as the Greeks knew, having a choice of rulers is not enough to have authentic people's power, democratia. And so to summarize the point against elections, if you will, to me, the real problem is that even under ideal circumstances, elections simply rely on human choice, which is inherently discriminatory and biased towards certain traits. It's typically charisma, eloquence, height, etc., but it could be other things. So even at the level of the ideal, elections operate as a principle of distinction between ordinary citizens and the rest of us. And that in itself is quite poisonous, actually, because it makes the rest of us think that we don't deserve to be there, that we have no place in places like parliaments, that unless you're capable of earning those qualities, you don't have a say about the substance of political decisions. And in fact, this is bad for citizens, obviously. It's bad for politicians too, because it convinces them that they belong, that they are the superior minds, that they alone have a right to speak for the people. And I actually had a recent encounter with a politician who told me, as I was defending the principle of citizens' assemblies that were housed in parliaments, for example, he thought this was profoundly anti-democratic, and that basically the riffraff had no right to sit where elected parliamentarians are currently sitting. So I think it's a fundamental, it breeds a certain type of contempt for the people that they represent. You might say, well, yes, but there's a periodic renewal of the pool of elected representatives, which ensures that there's a turnover, and in a way, electoral representation is open to all, because anybody can run for, elections. But it's a little bit like saying, like Marie Antoinette saying, well, let them eat cake, right? No, not everyone can run for elections, let alone win them. If you're a single mother with 4 children and or somebody who's working 2 jobs, or you're just too shy, you are never going to run for elections. And even if you did, you would not win them. So the result of this inherent discriminatory dimension of election is that you're bound to have, as a group of representatives of the country or the people, a demographically skewed sample, even again under ideal conditions, and even more so under non-ideal ones. So that's why, for example, the American Congress, which is perhaps extreme, but I'm not even sure. It's just so happened that we have the data for it in a way that perhaps we don't have it for other parliaments. In the American Congress, you have 84% of the members who count as members of the 10 wealthiest percent of Americans. 40% belong to the 1%. So how can we expect them to fully understand and address the plight of the working class? They are also overwhelmingly white and male. So how can we expect the problems of women's and Blacks or intersectional groups to be as fully taken care of than if there was a more accurate or descriptive representation of all the categories of the population? So it's not the case that the plutocratic dimension is present everywhere. In France, most of the government and members of parliament that are elected are overly educated. They're not all rich. But they're also, urban people who hardly need a car, so they cannot understand the consequences. They cannot fully understand the consequences of certain laws they pass, like, for example, the fuel tax that the Macron government tried to pass in the fall 2018, which ended up causing a massive, massive social protest called the Yellow Vest movements, because the Yellow Vest movements are a category of population that live in the suburbs, use their cars to get to their jobs, and were heavily penalized by this carbon tax, fuel tax. And they are not represented in parliament. And that's a problem. So again, even if you take money out of politics, you get rid of corruption, you still have a very minimal form of democracy where most ordinary citizens really only have the power to consent to the exercise of power by others, and very occasionally the power to kick them out of power. It's nothing to sneer at, but if you're asking me, is that enough to make for a democracy? I think the answer is no. So why is it that we are still stuck in an 18th century model of democracy? So this liberal Republican ideal. So I think there are many reasons. One is that, again, I mentioned it before, we are sort of blinded by by our own usage of the word democracy, we've cheapened it. We've made it to mean something too minimal. And so it's hard to ask whether we could do better. We could have democracy if we're already in a democracy. The other is that, and it's probably true in a lot of places, we actually value liberal and Republican concerns over democratic ones. I think in fact, there are not that many people who are authentic Democrats, especially not among ruling elites and among people at the top of society. They call themselves that. We call ourselves that. But actually, if you take seriously the ideal of democratic power, of people's power, it's often too radical and would involve too many changes for many people. So, but if we are serious about authentic people power, what would that mean? What would be enough? Well, for me, it's possible that would mean getting rid of elections entirely and starting from scratch with a different system. So in my book, I defend the vision of an open democracy, where I envision legislative power as something that ordinary citizens exercise directly at some point in their lives, not all at once. So it's not a direct democracy type of regime, it's a representative regime, but they exercise that power in turn. So it's basically the ancient ideal of ruling and being ruled in turn, modernized in my language as representing and being represented in turn. So it's a lot more about equal distribution of power, and in particular, the power of representing and making the laws on behalf of others than consent to the rulers. And the key body of that open democracy is an institution I call the open mini-public, a large randomly selected body of citizens gathered for agenda setting, general lawmaking, or topical issues. So again, as I said, in theory, in that model, you could do without elections of legislators at all. You'd have a parliament of citizen legislators. It's possible, and why is that better? Because with random selection, you have complete blindness to the properties of individuals. And so they're selected on the purely egalitarian basis of one person, one lottery ticket, if you will. So the democracy I have in mind would be quite different, and it would take a lot to achieve it, right? So we can talk about what that would demand, and we could talk about how we get from here to there, to that vision. It would probably mean massive constitutional reforms. For example, or among the easier ones, you could have abolishing upper chambers like Senate or the House of Lords in the UK to replace them with randomly selected assemblies. But it would also mean making the whole set of our institutions a lot more participatory, deliberative, majoritarian, and transparent. So I think I'm out of time, so I want to leave it at that. But that's the general picture of the open democracy model that I think would be enough for democracy.
Right. Hélène, fascinating. And of course, I only gave you 20 minutes, and your book is so rich with so many examples and arguments, wish we had time to discuss them. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I also want to, I must admire your multitasking, able to deal with spiders and democratic theory at the same time. So that was wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Georgi now, who I don't exactly know what he's going to talk about, but Georgi he's listened to you and he's read your book. So I'm expecting him to respond to some of your very provocative ideas. Georgi.
Thank you. These are wonderful ideas. Very important. I liked, in particular, I admire, of course, the historical dimension of it. I couldn't agree more. Democracy historically, from my standpoint as an organizational sociologist, was a cooperative of those who otherwise wouldn't have access to controlling the state. Democracy is basically about controlling state power, controlling the personnel and the policies. It emerges where first, in ancient polis, people, or in ancient city-states, people had enough resources to band together against the hereditary kings. So my simple formula when I have to explain Athenian democracy to my students is that olive oil plus wine plus iron tools and weapons, much cheaper than Bronze Age weapons, plus the landscape, which is not suitable for chariot warfare and growing a lot of wheat, equals democracy. I'm sorry if it sounds complicated a little bit, but commercial farmers with weapons, essentially, this was the foundation of democracy. It's a cooperative on mutual defense. We see something like that in the Caucasus. You might be surprised. Many people, I still get surprised myself when I see very similar, or analogous at least, instances, say, in mountainous Dagestan or in parts of Georgia in the 18th century. There, the great democratizer were the weapons, gunpowder weapons, spreading from mostly from Europe in the 17th and 18th century, which allowed commoners, common mountain peasants, to make a very neat hole through the expensive armor of a mounted knight. So people who had chainmail, very expensive chainmail, and horses, and who therefore had a huge advantage, moral and military advantage, over commoners, to the extent, that the main trade from the region we study was trade in humans. It was slave trade for centuries, exporting them into the Eastern Mediterranean. Beautiful women and men for the Mamluk corps, if they were lucky, or for copper mines somewhere in Anatolia. So that was a democratization in the 18th century in a very deep sense, historically, But what happened in the West was rather different, because it was the prevention, it was the abortion of democratization that might have taken place otherwise by revolutionary means. And I think Hélène, very honestly and concisely and just elegantly described, why it was done. So yeah, I just referred to the work of Michael Mann, one of our most important organizational sociologists today in the sources of social power. He, two things about the United States that I always admired in his work, early United States. First of all, that what should have been a federalist democracy was France. That's what was going to be federalist, because historically, 18th century France looked like divided into kind of very natural looking areas. So what is there in common between Occitanie and Normandy? So it's they are made, for being federal units controlled by their own elites. Yet this didn't happen because there was French Revolution and then Napoleonic Empire. That's something very important to imagine. And then in the United States, something else happened. Yes, there is a representative democracy, a republic, yet it did not become empire like under Napoleonic Empire. So why somebody like President Jackson stayed president rather than become an emperor? As actually many people would not be surprised at the time, because that was probably an idea of where democracy was going. Just like ancient democracies in Athens and in Rome, they produced charismatic leaders who become emperors, revolutionary or democratic emperors. It's a very common historical pattern here. So this is, then jumping, to our present. We cannot avoid, of course, what is happening now, the big war. I was asked to discuss democracy in Armenia. Frankly, I don't see a point, actually, discussing what is there. So in Armenia, you have a post-Soviet regime, which typical post-Soviet regime, because there are two kinds of them. Those which managed, which some faction of elites, usually a faction, not the most important faction, but usually a faction of old communist bureaucracy, managed to consolidate into a dictatorship or a patrimonial regime of one kind or another, like in Azerbaijan, like in Russia. In Azerbaijan, it's more based on family. In Turkmenistan, it's personality and family. In Russia, it is a small circle of people around the despot. And then there are failures not so much democracies as their failed consolidations of dictatorship. And those failures are Ukraine, where revolutions succeeded time and again. It's Georgia. And to some extent, it's Armenia. Armenia was going kind of in the more Russian direction, of normal direction for the East European post-communist regimes for about 20 years. And then we can discuss this, but I don't think it has much materiality at the moment. There was another Armenian rebellion. And curiously enough, in Armenia, perhaps for the historical reasons, I tend, as a sociologist, tend to attribute this to the legacies of extreme violence and genocide. Armenian police and military showed unwillingness to shoot fellow Armenians. And this is how the regime fell in 2018. I still wouldn't call it a democracy. Notice, that there is not even much of an effort by the new oppositionists in power, and they are that. They are people from the opposition previously, journalists who try to criticize the regime, and actually some quite charming former students of philology who have read a lot of Michel Foucault while in school, and now they are in parliament. I don't know whether it is charming or rather frightening. So these people, notice, are not even trying to change the constitution, which very comfortably was inherited from the previous despotic regime, or near despotic. That constitution removed the term limits, very cumbersome invention from the 1990s. And instead of a presidential regime, it's a parliamentary prime ministerial regime, and prime ministers can stay in power forever. And there are many nifty juridical mechanisms that prevent a possibility of removing a prime minister against his will. And this is what we have in Armenia now. However, does it matter? I don't think so. Because why Helene's book is important? Because we are living through a moment which might be akin to the early 1940s. It's a world war. What's happening in Ukraine is not a Russian-Ukrainian war. It's not even Putin's war. It's obviously, it's a world war. It's an effort by Western alliance to use capitalism itself as a weapon. This is quite remarkable. Those sanctions are attempting to use capitalism and the Russian involvement or involvement of Russian elites in capitalism as a means of punishment, withdrawing them from, or expelling them from capitalist elite networks and markets and opportunities. It remains to be seen whether this works. It might. It actually, would be much better than the alternative. But what is it directed against? Is it just Putin? I think much more. That in the early 21st century, we saw the sudden revival of gunpowder empires or states based on the former gunpowder empires of the 16th century. And to remind you, if an expert panel like us convened, say, in January 1500 to predict the global trends in the 16th century, they would speak about, of course, gunpowder and the end of feudalism. They would speak about the brilliant prospects of Islam, because 3 of the new empires were actually Islamic. That was Ottoman Empire, the Safavi Iran, and the Mughal India. It was, of course, brilliant prospects of Ming Dynasty China. And I actually wonder, would they have mentioned even the discovery of the Americas at the time? We know that it didn't happen that way, that Turkey, Persia, India, China had very bad 200 years recently, but they bounced back, and they bounced back with vengeance, claiming to be new basis of production, new national capitalisms, and new imperialisms. So Russia is not just alone in this. It's also, of course, it's Narendra Modi in India. It's the attempt of Imran Khan in Pakistan, but most spectacularly, this is the kindred spirit and kindred regime of Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. and of course, what emerged as a post-communist consolidation of power in People's Republic of China. So democracy in this respect is something very remote. It's actually the opposite of what would be the historical vector of these regimes. Their favorite reading, unfortunately, is not Hélène Landemore, but it's rather Samuel Huntington. As somebody, it sounds like a joke, but somebody very close to the Kremlin, somebody I can trust, already many years ago, 15 years ago, told me that Samuel Huntington is Karl Marx for the Kremlin today. This is what they want to hear. This is, soldier and the state, political order in changing societies, and especially the clash of civilizations. And that's why the prevalence of not cultural talk, but civilization talk in that part of the world. So we are talking already about reconstruction after the war, the landscape after the battle. Reconstruction not only in Ukraine, which will cost a lot. Reconstruction in places like Syria and Armenia and Karabakh, which might cease to exist. It will be ethnically cleansed, perhaps in the coming months. We don't know what is going to happen with Abkhazia and South Ossetia or Samachabla, whatever you call it. What is going to happen in Libya. But this is a very big question now, huge question to Western Europe. Are they prepared, if they are serious, to include, as they included after 1945, about 300 million people in the prosperity of the core zone in the world system? After 1991, there was an invitation extended to a few proletarian countries in Eastern Europe, but not to Ukraine and not to Georgia, whatever flag is hanging over the Georgian parliament in Tbilisi. That invitation was actually not forthcoming. It was a mistake, in my view. It was not only a hypocrisy of Western democracies, it was a mistake. But the mistake is very explicable because it has a huge cost. Will this cost politically be borne now? 45 million of quite poor but white people at the age of Europe are in Ukraine, and that will take a lot of money. A few more million people in Georgia and Armenia, but there will be many more in Russia itself. Can Europe exist with something resembling Syria at its borders now? And that's the main question where I have to leave you. We have to start planning optimistically because it's past the time to be pessimists. We have to start planning for the future after the World War. And after, let's hope, after the elimination of the current fascist-leaning elites in countries of Asia and Eurasia, as they prefer to call themselves. Thank you very much. Let's think ahead.
Georgi, thank you very much for putting that in such a broad and global context and looking in particular at the significance of the war in Ukraine and what impact that might have. It's obviously at some level an opportunity to change the way that we establish and control governments. But how we do that and whether, as you say, Europe and the United States is up to it is another question. But anyway, thanks for that. And I hope in the conversation as it develops, you talk a little bit more about your ideas about Armenia too. And in particular, thinking about the impact of Nikol Pashinyan's movement and the 2018 Velvet Revolution, as it was called, and what do you think about that? Whether actually it did lead to any improvement? My sense is that you don't think that it's inched Armenia any nearer to democracy. But I would like to hear your response to that. But let me first turn to Giga. Giga, if you could talk about maybe respond to what Hélène said, but try and think about whether any of these ideas and concepts that Hélène talks about are appropriate to a place like Georgia today.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I was very impressed by the broad historical sociological overviews of the first two presenters. My talk would be far more limited. But I will also start with some theory, at least with a definition, which I really like, of democracy, and which is actually quite a limited understanding of it as far as I understand. This is definition by German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who said that democracy, or modern democracy, is the splitting of the apex of the political system through the distinction of the government and opposition. So this distinction is a temporal one. So it's about a fundamental possibility that the ruling and opposition parties at the next elections change their places. This abstract definition of the concept finds its confirmation through empirical democracy research. So Huntington, mentioned earlier, offered famously a criterion to decide whether a given political regime is a democracy or not. And this criterion is whether peaceful transfer of power between at least two groups took place at least twice. So this definition has found a big resonance in the literature on democracy. And if we take it together with this Luhmannian formula and attempt to identify the common traits of the four political regimes which have existed in Georgia during the last 30 years, so after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we could try to find the problems which lie on the way of establishing functional liberal democracy in Georgia. So problems which make it difficult to split this apex of the political system and for the system to accept the fact that the opposition exists and should exist, as well as its potential to come to power and to build normalized constitutional mechanisms of the power change. Countries like Georgia usually are designated as hybrid regimes. Politically. So hybrid regime is a regime which demonstrates both democratic and authoritarian traits. And in hybrid regimes of this kind, there are regular elections. The opposition is legally not blocked from taking part in these elections and attempting to win them. But the whole political field is so structured by the power holders then that in the process, the opposition is always disadvantaged and the ruling party is always gaining the upper hand. Civil rights are guaranteed, but often injured, and independent media exists, but they are often objects of attacks from the government. Most of the time, the ruling group resorts to subtler forms of legal repression, so-called, which are directed against the political opposition to ensure that it never reaches this summit or this apex of power. So how is this kind of hybrid political regime maintained? In Georgia, I would say, and in many other places as well, there is this kind of a second type of hybridization. Which concerns the public institutions which ensure the efficient functioning of the political system. One can call this second type of hybridity the hybridity of organizations and networks. So basically, modern formal organizations, which are tremendously efficient, as you know, the Western kind of the organizations which originated in the West, with their impersonal rules, in countries like Georgia are being permeated by personal and personalistic networks, which ensure that these organizations, apart from fulfilling their direct roles, also support the power holders. We can talk in this context about neo-patrimonialism, that undermines the explicit distinction between public and private spheres and implies a mixture of modern and traditional practices and institutions. These new patrimonial practices differ from traditional patrimonialism through the fact that they have appeared in the context of modernization and they assumed the existence of modern institutions and used the latter to follow and accomplish aims very different from the ones which are inherent to these institutions. So there is this famous phrase of a couple of German philosophers who talk about simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. So this is what's happening actually in Georgia as well as in many post-socialist countries. On the one hand, one can observe processes in Georgia which can be only explained in connection with the modernization of societal institutions, like differentiation of diverse fields of modern society, such as economy, law, and politics, but also differentiation of the public from the private sphere, rationalization, bureaucratization, etc. But also there are parallel developments which basically mean to the kind of a parasitic permeation of those organizations by clientelistic, personalized networks. Now, to look at the development of Georgian recent history, you know, Georgia is a very young state, but a very old culture. So this is a kind of a tension. The culture is very strongly determined by this collective memory of the old medieval Georgian state, the last remnant of which was brought to an end through the annexation by the Russian Empire in 1801. But the political institutions, which are young, and the collective memory, which is of very old age, shows itself when this political class needs to find support in a political tradition, which is there in cultural representations, but does not exist for any practical purposes. So the history of modern Georgia has only one shining period from 1918 to 1921. But because it was followed by a 70-year Soviet rule, its experimental nature got forgotten, so to say, because it was an extremely interesting experiment, and Stephen knows, I think, globally the most about it, having written the best books and best talks about it. But there is another most popular text about this period by Eric Lee called The Experiment. And, you know, there is no spirit of experimentation any longer in Georgia after 100 years, because it was completely erased by this 70 years of basically experimenting with something which turned out to be the historical non-starter. Now, if we look at the last 30 years, one can differentiate four different distinct phases of the history of the political system. And usually, if you want to name them, you name them by the names of the people who were at the top. So you say, for example, regime of Gamsahurdia, you say the regime of Shevardnadze, you say the regime of Saakashvili, you say the regime of Ivanishvili. So during this time, during this period, the power changed hands 3 times. And all these changes were different from each other. First time it was the civil war. Second time it was peaceful revolution in 2003. And the third time it was through elections. This looks like a very neat progress, one could say, but it would be too early to predict the final stabilization or consolidation of the system, because the second case of peaceful transfer hasn't happened yet. And there are other factors which preclude us from regarding Georgia as a consolidated democracy. On the contrary, actually, there has been a talk of backsliding in recent years. So these 4 regimes were quite different from each other. And each of them came into existence as a result of a radical break, at least imaginary break, with the previous one. And it is all the more remarkable that if viewed from a formal point of view, each quite resembles the others. So I will just kind of list a couple of traits. First is the charismatic leadership. It is not by accident that all the four periods of the most recent history of Georgian political development can be summed up under the names of respective political leaders. So charismatic leaders are the central precondition of the one-party dominance in political system as it has been developing in Georgia. So accordingly, a political party is most of the time not an organization, but an informal network of friends and allies centered around the charismatic leader. This factor is correlated with the weak institutionalization of political parties. Second trait is one-party dominance, which controls most of the public institutions, including non-political ones. That's where they talk about organization and networks and permeation and parasitic relationship between the organizations and networks is relevant. The third factor is the culture of informality. The problem is a difficulty of dividing public and private spheres from each other. The extraordinary role of charismatic leaders makes the existence of formalized channels of communication and decision-making a secondary process, a facade, one can say, behind which informal networks operating according to informal rules and practices dominate. And the fourth trait could be called polarization and the paranoid style of the dominant political discourse. So it is evident that each ruling party, but also each oppositional party, regards the political process as a zero-sum game. In addition, each change of power is linked with the persecution of the previous power holders, which makes the normalization of the election process and politics in general extremely difficult. So each election is regarded as something revolutionary, as a radical new beginning or new kind of break from the old that does not happen within the system, but is supposed to destroy the system. And the paranoid style is a tendency to structure political debate around conspiracy theories, looking everywhere for the agents of the foreign powers or sabotage plans of the opposition, makes cooperation across the political and civic spectrum very difficult. Both this polarization and paranoid style in politics are expressions of a more general issue. Georgia is a typical low-trust society where the in-group, or actually not typical, but extraordinary, actually, example of low-trust society where the in-group cooperation is encouraged, whereas bridging social capital, which would link different groups with each other, is extremely scarce. There were some developments which gave some grounds for optimism. First of all, these facade institutions from time to time have shown the ability to develop their own autonomous dynamic and to become a real force for the change. For example, in 2012, the first time with this peaceful transfer happens, a political system allowed peaceful transfer of power through elections. Well, secondly, there was this prospect of the European and Euro-Atlantic integration, which played a very important role in maintaining the consensus on the subject of desirability of liberal democracy. And there was this conditionality linked with the integration prospect, but which was, of course, never remotely as attractive and as strong as in the cases of Eastern European countries. And there was this kind of socialization of the Georgian political and societal elites into European practices, which also played an important role to act as a counterbalance to the authoritarian and illiberal tendencies in the Georgian political system. Now, whether this latter factor will remain or will be stronger will depend, of course, on the outcomes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we are, yeah.
Giga, can I ask you to wrap up in about a minute?
Absolutely, absolutely. To answer this initial question, are elections enough? Well, not as such, but what would be enough, of course, elections which would ensure change in power on a regular basis. And of course, they should be supported by building public institutions such as independent courts, for example. And as for the relationship with the Hélène Landemore's fascinating book on open democracy, hopefully we can continue this in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Giga, very much. A wonderful analysis there of the, in fact, the failings, of course, of the liberal democratic system in Georgia. That model clearly has not taken root. And it has not empowered the population of ordinary citizens in Georgia. So I think you essentially underlined that problem. So here's the first question that I'd like to turn it back to Hélène. You've got two very pessimistic panelists here who enjoyed your book thoroughly, as I did, and really quite provocative and elegantly written. The question I guess both of them might be asking you is, well, this is okay for Iceland, you know, this is okay for Ireland, but is it something that could have any resonance at all in places like Georgia and Armenia, which both of our panelists have essentially described as oligarchic and patrimonial and deeply traditional and unlikely in many cases to accept the ideas that you propose. Could you respond to that? I know you've been asked this before, and it's a common question to you, but are your ideas appropriate to places like Georgia and Armenia, from what you understand from our two panelists here?
So I'm going to have to summon all the optimism I'm capable of, because I have to say the last months, and it's such a dark place for the world right now that it's really hard to, I'm not sure I could write my book today. You know, it's just terrible. But still, when I wrote it, I firmly believe that it was meant to, you know, have a universal value, that when we talk about people's power, it's not something that's Western or just for white, you know, Northern Europeans, and that's it. The fact is that I do rely on examples that are from that region of the world, you know, Iceland, Ireland, now France, because that's where we can afford to conduct such processes where you can deepen democracy where you already have it to some degree, and there's like willingness and enough of a sense of freedom in the population that they actually, you know, when they're given the opportunity to participate, they do through these new, you know, these conventions for climate or these citizens' assemblies. For other parts of the world, you might say, well, it remains to be seen. So right now I'm talking to, we're a group of people convened by the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. And there's a Malaysian businessman very close to the power circle there who's very interested in bringing some of those ideas to Malaysia, which, you know, has a whole range of very different issues, but that have to do with profound division between the Muslim community, which is the majority, and the non-Muslim groups, that issues of poverty, issues of, you know, gender issues, I mean, all kinds of things. And he thinks that it could work. At least he's willing to try it out. So I think I don't want to be arrogant and predict that this can work anywhere. I think it needs to be tried out. And frankly, when I hear these horror stories, you know, I'm thinking, well, you have less to lose in those regions in a way. I mean, the liberal Republican construct has kind of failed, right? It's been whatever the promise has been distorted, or perhaps it's revealed its true face. And so I think maybe it's time to try something new, and it's probably easier when you have nothing to lose than when you still believe in, you know, in elections, maybe. So I don't know. I think that the difficulty, if you want, is that if you don't have some minimal bar of, like, you know, rule of law and functional bureaucracy and certain basic components like that, it's hard to say, oh, well, why don't we organize a bunch of citizens' assemblies and try to get a sense of what people really want and how what solution they envisage for their own problems, right? Because if you don't have the infrastructure and the know-how and the willingness from somewhere in a position of power, it's just really hard. But I mean, talking about Ukraine, I was very convinced by Georgi's vision of this war as a World War III, even if it's not quite, you know, reached the level of, like, military engagement. Indeed, using capitalism as a means of war is, I mean, I don't see how, if you're Putin, you can't see that as a declaration of war, you know, by other means than violence. But well, so the question is, it's already a situation where, you know, citizens all over the world are kind of involved. They're sending money through Airbnb bookings. There are people who, I mean, it's maybe not that many, but there are people from all over the world who've joined, like, a special military contingent. People want to be involved directly without going through the existing top-down structures. And I think Zelensky is a genius from that point of view, because that's exactly, he's putting himself at the level of his soldiers, of his people, in a way that, you know, all our talking heads or presidents never do. You take Macron, you know, I'm from France, so that's one that comes to mind. It's always like in his little three-piece suit in front of his big, you know, office, that he wants to maintain this illusion of verticality and separation. And I'm not one of you, I'm so much better. And I think people are fed up with that, to a point that I don't think they realize. And Zelensky is doing the opposite. So actually, I could envision him, if he survives, when this war is over, saying, look, I don't have all the solutions. This electoral model has led to a lot of corruption, actually, in Ukraine. Why don't we try something new? Why don't we try to get, like, a bunch of regional assemblies all over Ukraine, get people to talk to each other? It would be very cathartic, if anything. It would, I mean, this is an amazing people, as we've seen. So I think some interesting things at the very least could come out. And these assemblies, you know, I always, as an epistemic Democrat, I've tended to focus perhaps too much on the knowledge aggregation component, how they can bring, you know, they can make emerged smart solutions to collective problems. But one of the beauties as well is the emotional bonding sort of properties they have on their participants. It's transformative, it's cathartic, it's healing. And I think that country will need a lot of healing. And this won't be done by some people getting, you know, to legislate for everyone else and being elected. And I think that's, so yeah, well, it's, you know, it's, who knows if this can be done. I personally, I'm pleading with, you know, the organizers of the next Democracy Summit in the US to budget some kind of funding to bring over our you know, Ukrainian friends and Eastern and you know, people from the Balkan, and why not from Georgia and Armenia, to come to countries like France, Iceland, Ireland, and learn and observe from those practices and just get the tools. I mean, because we're sending so much weapons, why don't we also send some democratic tools to rebuild after the war is over? You know, I think that would be good, and we can create bonds and bridges and stop ignoring them, as we've been doing until now. Anyway, so that's my very you know, limited attempt at remaining hopeful.
Right, I'm going to turn it back to you, Hélène, because and then I'm going to come to Georgi and Giga. You know, Georgi raised the broader connection between the possibilities or potentials of your model in a globalized and capitalist world. Oh, hold on, I'll wait a second. And Giga mentioned the experiment, as he put it, in the Georgian Republic between 1918 and 21, where indeed some of the ideas that you're talking about in terms of people's power were embedded in the Georgian constitution. There was an attempt to broaden it beyond what was considered the traditional bourgeois republic at the time. And many of these ideas and motivations came from socialist thinking. And I'm wondering how you relate your ideas to, more broadly, something that goes beyond capitalism as a structure or system that can support your ideas more effectively than capitalism.
It's a great question. So it's not something I touch on in the book because I think it's like it demands another book. But yes, definitely, I think the economic sort of superstructure also needs to be profoundly reformed. I mean, because you can fix politics all you want if you have corporations like Google, Amazon. It's going to put so much pressure on the narrowly political system that it's going to disempower it. So we need to rethink the economic organization. I don't know if I want socialism, but I know that capitalism is not solving the problem. So I think you personally, I would still want markets, obviously, but I would want a multi-stakeholderism, if I need to label it. So it's not necessarily like society owns the means of production. It's more that there are a recognition that there are a plurality of stakeholders in any sort of economic enterprise. There are workers, there are people who have investments to make other than labor, and there are consumers, and there are all these categories. And then there's the planet, and this other very important dimension that we all depend on. And so how do we create a system that recognizes that all of these stakeholders have a stake and that need to be given voice accordingly? So I think that one way to get closer to that, it's not necessarily by nationalizing all the big companies. I think that failed and that's not a solution. But things like co-determination schemes, like the one in Germany, where you have after the Second World War, they decided that to constitutionalize the obligation for companies beyond 500 employees to have worker representation on the board of the corporate board. So I think in their case, it's 49% of the board must be made up of worker representatives. Unfortunately, they're elected, which will reproduce some of the problems in the larger society. So it's mostly male, it's mostly white, it's mostly most educated, most all of these things. So it's an elite in itself. But I mean, it's already huge. And so you could imagine keeping that, adding a random selection component to it, or replacing the electoral system with a random selection component, or at least keep the electoral system if needed, but just expand that logic to all the corporations. And perhaps also encourage the creation of fully worker directed and owned firms, like, for example, the paradigmatic example is Mondragon in Spain, which is a worker directed and owned companies of, at one point it was over 80,000 employees. And the distribution of the profits was much more egalitarian. They didn't fire people as much during the 2008 crisis as the classical capitalist companies. So I think that nurtures also, because if you're an employee and you can have a voice and be heard, it empowers you in the political world as well. Meaning, it's a virtuous sort of circle.
Right.
It also changes perhaps the way you relate to others, the way you behave in your own family. I think these are, John Dewey used to say that democracy is a way of life, and it's not something you reserve for the particular sphere of politics narrowly defined. It's transversal to everything we do.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, Helen, I do have some questions, and I do apologize to the people who've put the questions on the Q&A, but I do want firstly to go back to Georgi and to Giga. I'd like, Georgi and Giga, if you could just keep it pretty short so we can then come back to some questions. Your response to Helene's talk, I mean, in particular, Georgi, the question of to what extent are the ideas that Hélène is proposing, to what extent are they compatible with the oligarchic and highly unequal system that we see in capitalist economies today? This seems to be something that concerns you, and you've been talking about a lot in your work. So could I go back to you and see if you can address that? Georgi, did you hear me?
Yes, but probably Giga should speak, because...
Yeah, Giga will come after you, Georgi.
I have very little to add here. I'm sorry. Probably, as a sociologist, I'm too skeptical of capitalist democracies in general. And so just imagine, this is a beautiful idea. Like I think, like majority of anarchist or libertarian ideas, what it would look like in a place like Ukraine, for instance, that's exactly what happened actually in the 1990s, that there were many different provinces. Provinces were each size more and probably richer than Georgia or Armenia. So I'm speaking about Odessa or Donetsk or Dnipropetrovsk or Lviv. Kharkov, of course, would be much bigger. And all these provinces, of course, developed local oligarchies or was seized by local oligarchies. And what maintained the semblance of democracy or regular revolutions in Ukraine was that they could not settle among themselves, the question of who controls the central power in Kiev. They were powerful enough to resist this, and they were not strong enough to impose themselves on other provinces. And that's what is quite interesting. It's this more or less the same ethnic group. You could claim, at least in Georgia, it was somewhat different, including in 1918, 1921. So when you say people, which people do you mean in the Georgian Republic?
Mm-hmm.
Which peoples do you mean? So I think it's an interesting exercise, very much like very abstract sociology, to imagine something different. I don't think it's very practical, but this is not your job, to be practical at all. You're not describing anything existing or that may exist. So this is poetry. And poetry in the sense, like, I wish people could fly. I wish people could talk to each other. Something. I wish justice existed in the world. Our job is to think, why people don't fly. And if they ever fly, then what force would take them into the air and how to bring them back safely. It's an engineering job. And I have very little to add here as an engineer.
Right. I think Hélène actually is doing some engineering here. She's trying to engineer institutions that would broaden participation by ordinary citizens. But the question is, and this is what I was really trying to figure out, is whether any of these proposals could actually work in places like Armenia and Georgia. And I understand that you're pretty pessimistic about that. Not only Armenia and Georgia.
No, they would be adopted, by the oligarchic elites, gladly, because this is a way to encourage separatism, as we call it, of different. So it will kind of split centralized democracies into localized democracies, and who would be the boss there? Of course, it's probably the son of a local party boss.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'll let Hélène answer this one, but in the case of Iceland, for example, it wasn't parochial. It was a national debate and discussion about the new constitution. Not that it got passed by parliament, but in that sense, it was not. It was trying to create a national solution from a random collection of Icelanders, right? But anyway, I'm going to let me pass on to Giga because we're running out of time. Giga, how would you like to respond?
I do think that there could be fields in which this broader concept of democracy could be usefully applied. For example, if we take the Georgian example, local government, right? So it is in dire need of reform. And I could imagine, for example, giving more power to the local government in the Georgian context would entail some kind of forums, so to say, in order for them to just start exercising their kind of democratic muscles. But on the level of on the central level, I think that the major driving force during the last 30 years has been the driving force of all the velvet revolutions and all kind of these changes is the drive for normalcy. And normalcy is understood as the kind of liberal democratic model existing in the West. It still exercises a huge appeal on the Georgian public, and I think elsewhere as well. We have also examples which succeeded quite well. For example, let's say former Soviet country like Estonia. We know that it worked. This is a model which worked in Estonia. So, okay, Georgia has a different history, but still part of this history was the common history with Estonia, right? So basically, I still think that liberal democracy is the only model existing, and if we don't pursue this model, then what will remain will be kind of gradually more and more authoritarian practices and roles. So,
okay, so I got some questions here. One from Jeffrey Rentz and one from Hans Gutbrod. One starts with the issue. I guess both these questions are addressing the issue of the problem that Georgi raised about the sort of fracturing of the political system that maybe will happen, Hélène, if some of your ideas go through. So Barbara Walter, this is the question, wrote a book, How Civil Wars Start. It argues persuasively that the greatest risk of civil wars to both established democracies and developing democracies takes place on the spectrum of democratic development or democratic regression, where factions become more important than commonwealth. And I think this was perhaps an issue that Georgi was referring to, this issue of the fracturing of the political system, and in the context of Georgia and Armenia, the rise of powerful oligarchs and warlords. So that was the first question. Second question from Hans Gutbrod, democracy does not mean people's power. That is simply a misrepresentation, a mistranslation. Second, as a perceptive colleague in the Caucasus pointed out, this proposal is a recipe for putting warlords in charge. So I don't know how you would react to those two questions, Hélène. They seem to be very skeptical about...
you know what? It's fantastic to speak in this context. It's a very different audience from the one I had before. And I really sense a gulf in terms of expectations, assumptions and definitions in particular. So I just mentioned that I was really struck that Giga took Niklas Luhmann's definition of democracy, which, why would you go to a sociologist who's notoriously, reactionary, doesn't believe in human agency, to define democracy? So I think it's interesting that the pessimism is such that the bar is really low for what should count as democracy, and that's fine. I come from a place of obviously privilege and optimism. I grew up in a country that never knew war since I was born. All of that. Suddenly, I err on the other side. But I do think that democracy means people power and not just peaceful alternance of parties in power. It means people's power, literally, etymologically. Demos kratos. I mean, how can you deny that? So the question is, beyond definitions and premises and all that, what would the translation of some of my ideas into the context of post-Soviet countries do? And maybe it would do terrible damage. I honestly, again, I really do not want to make recommendations. I'm a theorist, like Georgi said. On some level, what I do is ideal theory. Poetry, I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit more rigorous than that. But But I also want to point out that I've observed now a number of and studied a number of actual processes. This, I regret making my talk so abstract. Actually, maybe I should have talked about the Convention for Climate, the Irish Convention, or they took place again in very privileged countries in some respect, but they also, France was not on the border, on the verge of civil war, but we went through a really deep crisis in 2018. I was scared. This was as violent as it can get in France. And Macron was scared to death. So the reason why he did this great national debate that literally put the country on pause for 2 months is because he was scared. And he had two choices: repression, becoming a tyrant too, or Habermas, a much, in my view, more appealing German sociologist, meaning deliberation, talk to your people, listen to them. And so he tried to do that, didn't do it very well, the great national debate, very imperfect in many ways. But that great national debate that lasted 2 months got people talking. It was cathartic. And that was when we sort of prototyped and first experimented with national regional assemblies that were selected at random. There were 21 of them, including in our former colonies, like the overseas territories. And then because that worked and Macron became convinced that was actually an avenue that made people happy, his polls went up, back up, his legitimacy was reestablished. He said, okay, fine, I'll do the next thing, which is to give you a convention for climate with 150 randomly selected people at the national level. People said it's pure strategy, it's going to be co-opted, he's lying, he's going to manipulate the results, blah, blah, blah. You can be as cynical as you want. The fact is that after 9 months, these people, this assembly became a political actor of its own right. It really changed the conversation in France around climate change, and it has led to the most ambitious climate bill we've ever had, even as 75% of the proposals were disregarded. So again, very privileged circumstances, and it moved the needle only a little bit, but I think there are reasons to believe that you could replicate some of that, perhaps indeed at the local level first. I think that's actually, that's where I find a terrain of agreement with Giga and Georgi. I think at the local level, this could sort of, I like this phrase, exercise the democratic muscle. Sort of instill in people a sense of what they're capable of. And then, hopefully as a progressive movement, you don't know what can happen when you start something like that. I think we're just at the beginning. And again, the reason why it's not just poetry and pie in the sky sort of thinking is that there are, like now, there's a long list of cases, that have been quite successful. The OECD documents 600 cases of mini publics that have been conducted all over OECD countries, right? So of course, I don't think it ever happened in Georgia or any of the post-Soviet countries, but it's happened in the Balkan recently. They're trying to bridge the deep divides between Bosnians and Serbs and Croats. And I haven't looked at it very closely, but I know it took place and worked relatively well. It needs to be tried anyway before we can say for sure it won't work. I think pessimism, it's not an option at this point. Like, the situation is dire anyway, so we need to try something. And the warlords, I didn't quite get that. Like, why would it empower warlords?
Yeah, it's a question that needs some thought and unraveling. So I'm not quite sure what the question was.
Maybe it's because I wasn't clear enough that I'm thinking of using random selection for large groups only, not for like single functions like a president, or maybe for presidents you still need elections. And we can talk. I'm really focusing on legislative assemblies. And then, okay, I'll stop here. Probably.
I think we're going to have to stop. I do have actually quite a few other questions, and I do apologize to the listeners that I'm not going to be able to get to those questions. It was a very complicated and interesting debate, and what I wanted to get going was a conversation. I think we got there. Georgi and Giga remain skeptical. I'm in Helene's camp on this one. I'm actually more optimistic. I think that my own study of the First Republic suggested that these there is potential here for going beyond the institutional mechanisms of representative democracy. And I think that's the only way we can go if we're going to strengthen citizenship in places like Armenia and Georgia. But anyway, this is, we can continue this debate. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It was a really fascinating debate, hearing all of you, despite the disagreement between the poets and the engineers. And I want to thank Helen very much for starting this conversation. I hope we can continue it in other fora. Georgi, thank you very much for your time too, and Giga. I hope we can get together again and thrash out some more of these ideas about how to genuinely deepen citizen participation in political systems. All right, thank you very much. I think we have to end here. And again, I apologize to the listeners. I didn't get to all your questions, but I think we all benefited from the debate. So thank you very much, everybody.